Thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning on, as Dave said, one of a series of Plant Life's Fall into Nature programme that's been running throughout October. My name's Tim. I'm the engagement manager for the Dynamic Dunescape project. What I hope to do, share with you over the next 40 minutes or so, is just the work that we've been doing, why we're doing it, and some of the resources that have been developed. I thought it's important just to mention the partnership at the outset. It's a Heritage Lottery funded and EU Life funded project. It's a big project, £10 million over 10 years, and involving the partners at Natural England, the Natural Resources Wales, National Trust, Plant Life and the Wildlife Trust. So it's quite a large and complex project. So I mentioned we're working in England and Wales and predominantly on the Atlantic coast, but we also have sites in Lincolnshire, very different set of dunes in Lincolnshire. If you compare it to the Atlantic coast, which tend to be the image we quite often have of very tall and windswept dunes with prevailing conditions coming from the Atlantic. In Lincolnshire, the wind is slightly different, coming off the North Sea, so we tend to have sort of slightly lower and less wide dunes on the East Coast, but we have some very interesting projects going on there. And also our colleagues down here in Dorset on the Channel Coast, down at Purbeck. It's a very special dune system down there, which is dominated by dune heath, which is very rare habitat. So across the area, we've got 34 sites that are covering about 7,000 hectares that we're working on. So why the project there, and why we're working on sand dunes? Well, the surveys across Europe, particularly on the North Atlantic, have shown that the sand dune systems in Europe are the most at risk from biodiversity loss. Surveys are undertaken about every 10 years. There was a survey done in 2012, 2013, which identified that the dune systems were in a serious state, in declining and not improving. And the most recent update has shown that dunes are still struggling. They still remain the most at-risk habitat for biodiversity loss. The significant loss over several decades has been due to development and agriculture. I think it's something that we can identify and recognise, particularly if you look at aerial photography. You can see agricultural improvement, you can see where buildings have taken place, which has resulted in only 20,000 hectares remaining in England and Wales, and a 60% reduction in dune area in Wales since 1900. Those areas that we have got left are a sanctuary for very rare and specialist species, and they're particularly threatened because of the way that dunes have declined over the last 100 years or so. There are specialist plant species like dune gentian and purple milkvetch, and sand lizards and natterjack toads need very specific conditions for them to thrive. And there are specialist plants that only exist in what we call our dune slacks. They're damp areas within a dune system. So what actually is the problem? Well, what we've been very good at over the decades is stabilising dunes, stopping dunes moving, stopping sand moving. And I would guess we're all fairly aware of chestnut paling fences, Christmas tree recovery in the new year to help stop sand moving, particularly around car parks and opposite businesses. But what that stabilisation has done is reduced natural dynamism, the actual movement of sand through the sand dune system. And as a result of that, they're being smothered by fixed rank vegetation and invasive scrub. And we're increasingly year on year seeing even less bare removing sand, which these specialist and pioneer species need to thrive. But as a result of work that was done 10, 15 years ago, we're beginning to understand now that for a naturally dynamic moving dune system that supports this wide biodiversity, we need to change our conservation management activities, the way that we actually address dune management and how we keep these areas thriving and fully biodiverse. So I've got some examples, some really useful aerial photographs that just show the extent of how dunes are stabilised over the years. So here in Kenfig in South Wales. We've got a lovely picture on the left-hand side here, aerial photograph from 1947. The light area is all the area of bare sand and moving sand. So you can see there's not a lot of vegetation stabilising this dune system. But by 2013, there's a massive amount of stabilisation, vegetation encroachment, scrub encroachment has taken place. A very, very different landscape. And the specialist species will have been pushed to the very margins in these small areas of sand down here and a bit of a bare sand in here. Now, there are some people that have said we've been using aerial photograph evidence post-war, and a lot of this bare sand will be due to military activity. There's a huge historic industrial, cultural relationship with dunes and communities, particularly in preparation for the D-Day landings. But through the project, we have been able to find some amazing plate photographs that David ran a session a few weeks ago, and someone on that session shared some plate glass photographs from Kenfig from 1904 and looking towards Porthcawl in 1903. So we can see at the turn of the 20th century, these landscapes were very, very much more open. There's an incredible amount of bare sand compared to where we are today that would have been supporting a much wider range of wildlife and habitats. Now, this is repeated in Braunton Burrows. An example is just down the road from where I am. So we've got 1958, amount of bare sand is probably about, I don't know, getting on towards half of the site is bare sand. By 2020, again, massive amount of vegetation is beginning to take hold. This dark area is a very intensive scrub growth that's taking place up here. Again, the bare sand is pretty much constrained to the four dunes, a little bit of a natural blowout here. But if you can just look at this V, it's marking a spot up here towards the western end of the dune system. This is what this looked like in 2010, where actually there was a little bit of a natural blowout. This was the highest dune system, highest dune in the Braunton Burrows system. So people, you can see people here in the photograph, wanted to get up high to have a look around. As a result of that recreational activity, it enabled a natural blowout. So the conditions were right to actually blow the sand through the system. And this front is advancing by about 1 metre to 2 meters every year. So obviously there are interesting conversations there to be had about landscape impact, but on the grander scale of things, it shows that if natural processes are reintroduced, it does allow sand to move. Again, if you look across the rest of the site here, huge amounts of encroachment of scrub and invasive species taking place. What we want to do is try and get more herb-rich grassland and areas of bare sand. But just before we move on to what sort of interventions we're making, I think it's useful to have a look at what a natural dune system would look like. This is very schematic, but just to give you a feeling and what the key ingredients you need for natural dune dynamics. Obviously, firstly, we need sand, and we need extensive beaches where sand accumulates. Then at low tides, we need wind, and it's wind above about 4 meters per second to actually start moving the sand along and moving the sand from the beach inland into the dune system. Now, the stronger the wind, the higher the sand dune. So if you're out in the dunes and you're looking up, I think some of the tallest dunes are up in North Wales, that gives you an idea of the extent and the power of the wind blowing through. You also need water, and particularly groundwater, where the water table is, for our dune stacks. These areas are really important for great-crested newts and really important for breeding natterjack toads. They tend to be dryish in the summer, maybe a bit damp. In the water, these will, in the winter, these will fill with winter. Come springtime, there is a habitat there for particularly natterjacks to breed in. And then obviously the plants and the variety of plants that are there that then support the insects, the pollinators that are associated with dune systems. And there are really sort of two elements to a dune. There's this The mobile dune, it's sort of just closer to the sea, where we tend to get early successional species, a lot of specialist species here. And on the strand line, this is where it all starts to begin. If there's a plant or a bit of debris or a stone, the sand will start to accumulate, make the conditions right for a plant to grow. That turns into an embryo dune, and bit by bit we get this early successional dune system. Behind that, we tend to have semi-fixed dunes and fixed dunes. That's where there's more established vegetation, where we get our grassland and our herb-rich grasslands. What we need to try and control is the invasive species coming into this area and competing. So they're the key elements that we have in our sand dune systems. So what are the major threats and issues? Well, I've mentioned invasive, native and alien species. They tend to outcompete the natural flora and the specialist and smaller species. As they compete, they change conditions that encourage scrub growth, rank vegetation, so some of the very much thicker grasses, hawthorn, buckthorn, those sorts of things starting to come in. As they stabilize the dunes, they bring the dunes together through their root system, and as they go through their life cycles, they start to increase nutrient levels. Sand dune systems are very poor in terms of nutrients, very calcareous. That's why there are specialist species that are there. As the nutrition changes and becomes more humic, more humus in there, that tends again to favour rank grass and invasive species. We now know that nitrogen deposition from air pollution has a massive impact on dune systems. And if you add in nitrogen to an increasingly fertile soil, again, that tends to favour the rank vegetation and outcompetes the native wildflowers and plants that are associated with dunes. All of that taken together is a negative spiral that then increasingly stabilises the dune systems, and we see less and less bare sand. So the actual sand dune, the sand element of sand dune habitat is shrinking, and we're losing connectivity between the different elements of the dune system. So more and more vegetation, more and more rank vegetation is making these areas of bare sand and the slacks increasingly isolated, and they're not connected to each other. So each site, so we've got 34 sites, so each of those sites will have a conservation intervention of some sort of management taking place that varies from site to site, and it's informed by and driven by good science, surveying those areas, what are the environmental conditions, what geomorphological surveys will take place, which is looking at topography, looking at wind direction, looking at rainfall. And I think the important thing to say is that we're not saying all bare sand, we're looking for more bare sand. And if we look, going back to Braunton Burrows, the interventions we're making with Braunton Burrows, it's only on about 6% of the site that we're looking to increase the amount of bare sand. So, for example, if there was an area in front of a car park, or an area in front of a cafe or a business, or in front of a road that leads into a residential area, there are interventions that we wouldn't make, because there are obviously going to be implications for having blown sand moving around the area. And I'm sure those of us that have visited sand dunes regularly in the winter, when you see sand blowing, it does blow onto roads if it's close to a road. So it will be the right intervention at the right place in the right time, based on good science and good surveys. The sort of works that we'll be undertaking will be looking to increase the amount of bare sand by removing invasive species, removing vegetation and scrub to try and restore the much shorter grass, the different varieties of sward heights for grass and vegetation, restoring dune slacks, so ensuring that they do get wet in winter and are wet enough in spring to enable nasjack toads, great crested newts, other amphibians to thrive. And also introducing and reintroducing grazing species. We've got examples where we have in Dorset and in Woolacombe dunes, they've reintroduced red Devon cattle using no fence technology. So it's actually using tags basically to allow the cattle to move freely around the site. And what we found is that it's all very well doing these major intervention. But if you don't then back that up with ongoing grazing, it won't be long before you start to see the invasive species and the scrub coming back. I think one of the things that is quite innovative and important about the Dunescapes project is the scale at which we're working. It is really ratcheting up and working at a scale which involves heavy machinery. So it's actually engineering to a certain extent to try and ensure that there is enough bare sand moving within systems. So the next few slides just show some examples of the scale of the work that we're doing. So this is at South Walney in Cumbria, and you can see they've stripped off probably the top 6 to 8 inches of of soil there, which has been enriched, which has got far too much organic matter in it, and getting back to a much more sandy base, a much more nutrient poor base. And also within that sand, there will be the seed bank that will enable wildflowers and wild plants to come back. Possibly the biggest engineering activity and the most controversial part of some suggestions that we're making are what are called notches. And this is actually cutting into the foredune. So here we've got the example Ainsdale up in Sefton. What we've got here, you can see someone stood in the bottom there. That area has been mown, ready for the notch to be cut through. We've got other examples of notch a bit later on. But you can see again, the scale of what we're talking about is quite significant. But this notch, which we hope will allow the wind to blow sand through the system, is 3, 4, 5 kilometres from any habitation at all. You can see in the distance here some buildings. And what you can see behind is just this. There is sand under here, but these humps are historic sand dunes, but they just become stabilised and over-vegetated. Now, I mentioned the importance of surveys. This work was due to be done in May last year, but a survey revealed that it's a really high breeding population of sand lizards, which is fantastic. So it was mown to enable the sand lizards to move into other areas, and this work we hope will be done next season. One of the other things that we've learned through the project is, as this is an engineering activity, it requires planning permission. So we're having to get planning permission to carry out the works of this notch in Sefton. The other thing that's been interesting, that different planning authorities interpret engineering in different ways, so we are getting different advice in different places. Down in Dorset, again, removing scrub, moving beyond using a bow saw and cutting by hand, to actually using mechanical means to actually rip out the vegetation, get it out by the roots. Again, we need to make sure that as far as possible we can remove the vegetation, ideally off-site. That too brings its own challenges, but if it's being left on-site, to have very carefully identified areas. But again, what we're trying to do is expose bare sand. And I've got a really good example in Oxford of working at scale, which brings together a number of these activities, so you can see what we're trying to achieve. So this is at Oxwich in South Wales, and on the left-hand side, here we've got the foredune. So here we have our sand source on the beach. Here's the foredune. Here is all the over-stabilised dune in behind. So this is what it looks like looking inland with the sea behind us. The vegetation comes right down to the beach. There's very little opportunity for the rare and pioneer species to be active. So what our colleagues at Natural Resources Wales have done is dig a notch. So this is, again, the scale of the operation, several metres deep, and looking from with the sea behind us, looking through the foredune, exposing both bare sand in the notch itself, but also giving this area the opportunity to have windblown sand coming through the site. So here's a before and after shots. So on the top slide, there's the foredune, sea is in on the other side. We have got a dune slack here, which is great to see. But what the engineering works have done there, again using diggers and mechanical means, cut the notch in, stripped off some of the more dense vegetation to expose bare sand and increase the amount of standing water in the dune slack. And slightly different view. So the top view before the work was done, but down below you can see there's the notch, there's the reprofiling, getting that more of a dune slack in there. It's another lovely view to give you an idea of the scale, looking across the side. A couple of people here stood in the notch. So again, you can see this is working at scale. We've got plenty of evidence of after only a season, we're getting all sorts of orchids coming back, all sorts of species that have been struggling to survive and thrive. And there are some people who have a bit of concern about the scale we're working on. Well, actually, it's a good aerial photograph of Oxwich, where you can see on the grand scheme of that dune system, this is the area that's being worked in. It's actually only a small proportion. Again, you can see basically along the majority of the dune, the 4 dunes are fairly stable. The vegetation behind is fairly stable, getting quite an amount of scrub encroachment here. So we've got a bit of a blowout happening there. That's the notch that's being created. And the reason for the angle will be based on the surveys that have been done. Where are the prevailing winds coming from? Where do we want the sand to blow? So prevailing winds coming in off the Atlantic in this direction. Hopefully this will enable this area to start to regenerate naturally. So what are our aims for the project? Well, we're hoping to restore 7,000 hectares of habitat and get 35% of the total sand dune resource achieving favourable condition. At the moment, our sand dune systems are in declining, are in unfavourable condition and declining. So we need to reverse that to increase biodiversity, to increase the pioneer species, to increase the specialist species. So 33% of those species to be supported, and we have providing new learning, understanding and training and resources for landowners, land managers and for the conservation world. So I'd just like to dwell on that just for a moment. It's been over the last sort of 10 to 15 years that this new thinking has been brought to the fore. There's been a lot of work done in the Netherlands. There's been work done in Kenfig and down at Bourne Burrows, which has informed the new way of looking at how do we manage our sand dunes. So what the project has done has taken that learning, because we have a hearts and minds work to be done with existing land managers, with existing sand dune owners. We're very good at stopping dunes moving, at stabilising things. We know how to do that, and that is still being taught in colleges. It's still the normal thing to do. How do we stop dunes moving? So we'll see lots of tree planting, we'll see the chestnut paling fence going up. But what we're trying to do is encourage in the right place at the right time to actually change the way we do. We need natural dynamism. So we've got a couple of online learning resources that you might be interested to have a look at. There's quite a detailed one for sand dune managers, which takes sand dune managers through some of the key activities they could undertake and what to think about. There's also a more general introduction to dynamic dunescapes and into dune dynamism that's available on the website as well under our citizen science tab. And that is just taking both experienced land managers, people new to the industry, or the general public through what dynamism is and what we can do to improve that. All of that is based on a very weighty tome, the Sand Dune Manager's Handbook. This was commissioned and written by the UK's leading experts on natural dune dynamics at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. It was developed and written in collaboration with site managers. So we're bringing that frontline practical experience into the handbook itself. So it's not an academic paper. It is a very practical resource, a practical handbook that helps people through the various stages, helps them through what surveys they might need to undertake, where they can get that information. and what some of the key considerations. And that's really important for us because there are a lot of people now coming into the industry, into the conservation world, that will have come through their A-levels and degrees where the teaching is still about sand dune stabilisation rather than natural dune dynamics. So this is a step change in our understanding of teaching. We've also run a significant engagement program, because as well as getting the hearts and minds of our landowners and land managers, what we're proposing is quite radical for some people in terms of public access and what the public can and can't do. So it's the same, the engagement program is all part of the same overall aim to reverse decline of biodiversity habitat. But we want to help people understand why these activities need to take place. Any of you that have been involved in any conservation project where it involves a change, whether that's scrub clearance, or in our case bringing notches or scraping out areas of what seems to be perfectly healthy habitat, that can trigger responses in people, which is great. They care what's going on, what's happening, why are you doing that? That seems such an inappropriate thing to do. Well, through our engagement programs, we're able to get people on site, we're able to run events like this webinar and saying the reason we're doing this is to enable increased biodiversity. We've got the evidence that this works. So influencing site managers and site owners, but also we want to get more and different people involved in sand dunes. There's something like 270 million visits a year are made to the beach in England and Wales. A lot of those visits are made parking in the car park and getting to the beach, and forgetting the bit in between, which are these amazing landscapes, these amazing habitats with amazing creatures. So what we're trying to do is trying to slow down people's movement through the sand dune system. Yes, get to the beach, but maybe have a bit of an exploration about what's here in the dune, what animals, what plants. We also want to gather stories from people. What is their relationship with their dunes? What stories can they tell us? What are your experiences? What's special to you? Would you like to get involved in managing these places and looking after them in the future? Dynamic Dunescapes is a time-limited project in terms of its funding. What we need to do is ensure that there is I'm going to use the legacy word, to ensure that there are people that are fully engaged, fully understand and care about these special places, that can continue to work alongside the landowners and the land managers to ensure that biodiversity doesn't go into decline again in the future. So in terms of engagement, the project has got some key areas: volunteering, getting people out to the dunes, seeing what they can do. That may be through undertaking citizen science activities, it might be undertaking practical works, it might be doing visitor surveys, it might be recording people's experiences, it might be taking fixed point photography, it might be taking groups out. So there's a whole range of activities that people can do. We're training volunteers in the skills that they might need to help us in managing these spaces in the future. And also looking at how there's a term called visiteering that's been used by the National Trust. When people are on holiday, particularly at the coast, they might want to get involved in something for an afternoon, for a day, as well as enjoying the holidays that they're on, by putting something back into the environment that they're enjoying, that they get experiences from. Through the development phase of the project, it was identified that a lot of the communities living within 45 minutes to an hour of sand dune sites tended to be older people. So we've done a significant amount of work working with older people who are living with dementia and their carers, to how can we make these sites more accessible for them. But at the same time, the statistics show there's about 485,000 people who are living with dementia. But when you include their carers, their families, their care networks, about 3 million people could benefit from being able to get active and involved in dune systems. At the other end of the scale, the communities in and around dune systems tend to have a lot of young people, and particularly young people that are not necessarily in education or training. So we're running bursary schemes and training events and taster events to see if we can infuse and activate young people to get involved in conservation management, using their local environment as the place to excite them, and hopefully giving them skills and learning to enable them to find their pathway into a career in conservation. We're running a whole range of training events for site managers and site owners. One of the really key things and a really positive way to get a landowner or a land manager to think differently about a site is by undertaking site visits, actually going and looking at a site where something has happened, demonstrating that it works, and making them think, oh, maybe this is something I could do, something I could introduce back on my site. And we've also got programs running for schools, colleges, field studies councils. Again, traditional thinking has been about stabilising dunes. We need to get into the thinking that, as well as the ability to stabilise a dune, we need to be able to manage and introduce natural dune dynamics into the systems. So that's me sort of wrapping up there. I'm very happy now to go into a Q&A session for anything that's coming up. But David wants to come back on live, and we can talk to each other, and any questions that come up we'll be more than happy to try and answer. So hopefully that's been a useful introduction to a new way of thinking about how we manage our sand dune systems in England and Wales. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. So we've had, I mean, it raises lots of interesting points. So there's two questions have come in, and if you do, and you're watching, you have any thoughts, ideas, you just want to know some more detail, please just write them in the Q&A panel or the chat function. So Vicky has just asked a question about how do we keep the scrapes open, and how do you control bracken and old man's beard? So I guess we're doing the work. How are we hoping that this is sustained?
Thanks, Vicky. That's a really important question that you pose there. There's the initial works. I think we, as organisations, we're actually quite good at actually being able to do the clearance. You know, you can do it mechanical means, in the right place, using the right chemicals, possibly, so that we know how to get rid of stuff. But that keeping them open, that's really important. And I think that's where the grazing regimes are really come into play. And there are different animals graze in different ways. So cattle are very good at sort of dealing with the rough stuff, if you like, but they're fairly indiscriminate in how they graze, and they'll leave clumps around. So you might bring cattle into a certain area if you're trying to achieve a certain type of grassland habitat. Sheep, on the other hand, sheep and goats, they nibble very consistently, so you'll get a nice consistent grass sward. Though depending on what sort of, again, what outcome are we trying to achieve for that particular site, what sorts of vegetation are we trying to get, what sort of plants are we trying to get, you might bring in a different animal there. Ponies, they graze differently, so that's another option. And then there's rabbits. Up until the 1950s, rabbits were a key natural grazer in sand dunes, and it was the introduction of myxomatosis that basically wiped out the rabbit population that I think was one of the reasons why there's so much rank vegetation starting to come back. Not only rabbits good at grazing, digging their burrows, they're fantastic for little bits of bare sand. And where you have a big burrow system, you have quite a lot of bare sand. That enables, again, pioneer species and settled species to colonize. So I think that's it will be a mixture of grazing animals, mechanical means, again, if you needed to go back in. But quite often, if you get an area opened up, if you do have a really active volunteer group, it's much easier to control that rather than things being overrun in the first place. One of the challenges, I'll stop in a moment on that, Chris. One of the challenges we've had across a number of sites is unexploded ordnance from military training in the Second World War. Particularly Broughton Burrows, we've had to get in unexploded ordnance surveys done and experts in, and there have been 6 live mortars of various types have been found. So before we go on to a site, again, it goes back to those surveys, making sure you've surveyed in all the right ways, not just for wildlife, not just for geomorphology, but also for any other hazards that you might come across, because we wouldn't want a digger hitting unexploded bombs, basically. So hopefully that answers that question. Keeping it open, grazing, mechanical means, volunteers.
Super. So I've just added a response there. So there's some further information around conservation grazing. So I've just put that in for a Wales-focused project. Ian, we have a couple more questions. There's one big one that you might want to just have a quick read of that I've given a response to. So just as we began, Phil asked how much, we'll come back to answer this, but how much dune habitat will be lost to sea level rise and increased storminess? So just so you can have a think about that, I have put some responses in. And then we have another question from a gentleman called Ian. Why was stabilisation seen as important in the past?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ian. That's an interesting question. And I think it's more of a default situation where stabilisation was seen as important because it's that mixture of agricultural reclamation and development that takes place anywhere in the countryside, but particularly adjacent to or on a dune system. You're putting in systems and infrastructure that are fixed into what historically in nature is a very dynamic system. So the sand is going to carry on blowing around. So you build it again. I'm sure we've all seen it. That you go to any coastal area where there are dunes or a big beach, and you've got the road has been built right up next to the beach, right up behind the dune. The minute there's a bit of wind blowing, that sand is naturally moving. It's what we want to see. It starts going over the road, going into car parks, going into shop fronts, starting to cover the field in sand. That's not seen economically as a good thing. So that's one reason, stabilise the dunes to stop them blowing around. And also it links into the question about coastal defence as well. That I think a lot, the dunes are on the right scale, they are a natural coastal defence system. But because they've been so, in my view, they've been so squeezed by agricultural development, they're becoming increasingly less effective because they're not able to do that dynamic moving in and out, following a storm in, following a storm out. There's some really interesting aerial time-lapse photography images that I've seen recently that shows how sort of these natural systems do change, and we know that they change. This longshore drift, the coast is changing all the time. I feel it's because we've built and developed on a dynamic system. We are now, unfortunately, suffering the effects of those impacts. The dynamic system can't do its job of being a natural coastal defence because it's been squeezed, it's been denuded. So I think that there are perceived issues. Some of those will be real issues around sea level rise and the impact on dunes. But I think the works that we're doing, particularly, as I said, about on the surveying side, those notches where it may appear that actually, you're allowing floods to come in there. They're 3-4 kilometres from any habitation, any agricultural use. So that isn't going to be an impact. I think the impact is going to be more due to sea level rise, and it's not the conservation measures. It's the issues around pollution, climate crisis. All the things that are causing the climate crisis is what's causing sea level rise. It's not necessarily the impact of works that we're doing in June. There is a much bigger issue that we need to be engaged with COP26 coming up. That's where that discussion needs to take place. If we take action now around climate change, then the impact on the dune systems will be less, and in terms of flood defence, and hopefully we won't need to keep putting in groins and concrete structures, all those sorts of things, which unfortunately don't seem to work very well anyway. It just displaces the erosion further down the coast. So I think it's complicated. I'm not saying it's an easy answer, but it's the the management regime we're trying to introduce, I don't think will impact particularly on coastal sea defences. There are bigger issues at play.
Thanks, Tim. And yeah, and it should be noted, a third of all UK dune systems are no longer dune systems, and in Wales, 2/3 of our dune systems in the last 100 years are gone. And actually, what we see on our coastal plains, that it's not just agriculture; it's industry, and a lot of our industry is going to become seriously under threat as a result of increasing severity of storms, because there is no natural self-sustaining process, i.e. the building of sand dunes. Sand dunes build up over time out into the sea and could potentially create an ever-increasing barrier. That obviously takes time, but over a 10-year period, a sand dune can grow 25 meters, if not more. So there is something in mobilizing dunes that might also, or could potentially, by allowing sand into the dune system, by creating some of these breaks at suitable places in the front, that actually we can enhance their ability to protect the natural dune habitats where we are working. And I think the bigger issues we'll see is with sea level rise and increasing storminess is when we have industry and housing with just a slither of dune system in front of them, because there's none of these natural cycles that we're trying to encourage. We've got a few more questions. So one from Deb. She's saying that, do you think the change in sand dunes being overgrown is due to soil improvement, nutrient enrichment, or how much is this affected by invasive species?
I think the when we went back to what some of those threats are, I think one of the major impacts on dune stabilisation in terms of rank grasses and scrub is the improvement or the enrichment of the soil, because sand dune systems are naturally very calcareous, very poor nutrients. So the species that live there are incredibly adapted to salty conditions, arid conditions, and low nutrients. With nitrogen deposition, that starts to increase the fertility of the soil, which tends to favour rank vegetation, and so things that it's what gardeners are doing all the time, is putting fertiliser on their plants to make them grow quicker, they can grow faster. So by basing nitrogen as a fertiliser, that getting into the system increases the nutrient level, increases growth rates, favours the more vigorous, fast-growing species plant. It favours invasive species. Unfortunately, they just seem to thrive whenever there's a bit of nutrient around. And then you get into the cycle as the invasive species and the rank vegetation and the scrub grows, dies, it becomes a circle of nutrient enrichment, which again pushes out the native species and pioneer species plants, because they like low levels of nutrient. They like more light, they like disturbed conditions. There's a whole range of things that nutrient enrichment is one of the challenging aspects in dune systems. Hopefully that answers that one.
Yeah, it should be mentioned that some of the invasive species that we see on our dune systems, so Rosa rugosa, the Japanese rose, these are plants brought from incredibly different environments that thrive whether there's nutrients or not. They're able to send deep roots, grow swiftly and quickly. They're useful plants, but their dominance in our system, in the dune systems, can play quite a big role in impacting them. So it's not necessarily nutrients, it's the fact there's this abundance of invasive species. So Rosa rugosa is planted in council buildings, as an example, and it's very easily spread and moved toward, and hedgerows of industrial estates. So it's very easily moved into our dune systems, which are these incredibly dynamic spaces, and they're just able to take advantage of those opportunities. So they can, if left unchecked, completely dominate huge parts of the dune system. I've just finished doing some research work with some students, and as another example where there was the buckthorn planted and introduced, there was an average species count of only 4 plant species in where there was significant sea buckthorn. In the dune system where it had been removed, we were seeing an average of 15 species in those areas. We can see it also highly detrimental to the ecology there as well.
Sea buckthorn is a fascinating one because on the west coast, it's a real no-no, big invasive, and a lot of effort's going into to remove sea buckthorn. On the east coast, over in Lincolnshire, it's seen as a native species. So that's where conservation gets even more complicated, and it's where each site will have its own management plan depending on what's trying to be achieved there. So one side of the country, big invasive, big no. On the other side, it's quite valuable. Something else went through my head then, just want to talk about invasives. Also, this is the hearts and minds bit about invasives as well. It's quite often invasives are very pretty and very, very flowerful and big and blossomy, and it's what people are used to. And a lot of the species that the plant species in particular that we're looking to get the right growing conditions, the right habitat for, are delicate and quite small, and not that in terms of icons, and that's not that iconic in size. They're iconic in their rarity. Braunton Burrows has got dune gentian. It's only one of 2 sites in the whole country that's got dune gentian, but it's not as big and bright and colourful. So when you start to clear the big and bright and colourful things that people are used to, again, that sort of sends alarm bells going off in people's minds. What we're trying to do, and colleagues like David are trying to do, is say the reason we're doing this is so that we can enable this. And when you see a massive stand of fen orchid, it is just absolutely fantastic, and it shows what and that can happen within 12 months once the area's been cleared. And so it's making those connections with this is why we're doing what we're doing. Dynamic Dunescapes is a biodiversity project. Biodiversity is incredibly important internationally. It's another crisis that we're in. And sand dune systems in Europe are the habitat that's most at risk of losing its biodiversity. So it is actually, I feel, quite passionate and quite critical about this is why we're doing what we're doing.
And they're probably important to mention as well that there's been very clear evidence to suggest that, to address the climate crisis, we also have to address the nature crisis. Nature has been declared we are in an extinction level event in Wales, but nature is one of our key living, actual, real solutions to drawing down carbon, as well as significant other things, stopping of other things that will release it. So these 2 things can sit and should sit hand in hand. We've got another question in here, Tim, from Charlotte. Really interesting. She's saying, will managing the farmland around dune systems to fix nitrogen potentially help reduce the nutrient enrichment on the dunes? As an example, encouraging legume mixes that can draw down nitrogen and fix it into the soil.
That's a really interesting question, Charlotte. I like that. I wonder if you should be writing this down and writing to someone saying, I've got an idea. I think it would depend on what the farming system is that is around the dune system. So I'm going to use, again, Braunton Burrows is my example, my local example that I know well. There are two major impacts, I think. One is the wider catchment. So not just by the dunes, but going back into the water catchment, goes back up into the hills, where there's a lot of dairy farming is quite prevalent in the southwest. So where we're getting pollution much higher up in the catchment that then comes down through watercourses, that eventually finds its way down into the marshy areas around Braunton Burrows. So I think there's the sort of the catchment thinking needs to take place. How do we stop diffuse pollution taking place in catchments? The other issue in and around Braunton Burrows is that the marshes, they're traditionally grey, so that's quite good. So we've got this other really important habitat in behind the dunes, but it does affect the water level. There's sluices and dams and all sorts of things for managing the water level in the marshes, which inevitably I think, will have an impact on the water levels that are going out into the dunes where the groundwater sits. So again, it's one of those things that on the surface of it, you think, oh, this might be quite a straightforward thing to do. It is looking much wider, and I think it's one of the important aspects of the Dunescapes project is about landscape scale, is looking beyond our immediate landscape. So you're absolutely right to identify the farmland around, but also then going much further into catchment management. How does that impact on things? What we've also are doing through Dunescapes is something called Site Nitrogen Action Plans, SNAPs, because nitrogen is really being seen as a major impact from industrial activity, from air pollution through vehicles. So something needs to be done, and you may well have an idea of a solution there, but whether that would be enough in the grand scheme, this is where as a conservationist and environmentalist, we've got to look so much bigger. We're working on one particular habitat, but we need to work with colleagues who are working on farmland habitats, other coastal habitats, whatever it is. Those are where the nature solutions on looking on a massive scale. That's where we need to be putting our thinking. That's where we need to put in our effort. So it's important that we do what we do, but we need to make sure that's linked to other projects, other conservation management activities. And for example, the Broughton Burrows is the core part of the United Nations UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, and that Biosphere Reserve spreads out for about 50 miles in every direction. So it's looking at that much more holistic. How do we manage this much bigger area for natural solutions to the crisis that we're facing? So I like the idea. Hopefully that gives you sort of an idea of what could be done.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tim. If anyone else has any other questions, I think really nice way to finish. Our work has really been focused on these niche but diminished habitats of incredible ecological importance. We must, as whoever we are as communities, we must almost really be considering our catchment areas, because ultimately, it was touched on earlier, heavier rains, heavier storms. This is, a future that is being lined up for us, that by looking at a catchment scale, we can say, well, what actually can be done? We need healthy rivers. Healthy rivers feed healthy sand dunes. And the water tables in our sand dunes is something that plays a really key role in continuing to provide another variable that creates the incredible diversity. So our dune slacks, these seasonally flooded areas, rely inherently on their flooding in winter. It allows this incredibly diverse range of plants, insects, and so forth to exist there. I was just out on Kemfig National Nature Reserve a couple of days ago. There are herons feeding in the dune slacks. The otters move from the pool into those dune slacks through winter. But looking, at a bigger scale, and I think maybe we draw back to that idea of thinking or working locally, thinking globally, and that we need to, as people that are concerned about environment, people that want to address the issues, because above some of our dune sites, we have areas that flood and people's homes flood. So if we want to consider our communities, then we need to just think, locally, this is going to help with this. Regionally, let's pick up these other projects and support them or encourage them to take place, and globally there are bigger asks again, which can feel quite overwhelming, but just picking each bit up as we go. We're touching on work that will impact a large range of our dune systems, hopefully to support and provide a refuge for the incredible variety of wildlife across England and Wales. So just finally, if there are any other questions, or if you'd like to make a closing statement, Tim.
Yeah, okay. I just, again, thank you for your time, everyone that's on the webinar. Thank you. We do appreciate that. We have colleagues all around the country. If you want to visit our Dunescapes website, if you do want to get involved with any monitoring work or any training courses, do sign up for the newsletter. Equally, Plant Life, if you would like to get involved in plant and fungi conservation, there are plenty of opportunities. Do visit Plant Life's website, get in contact with us. We'd be delighted for you to get involved. So hopefully for what for me is quite a grey day. It's been a nice little trundle around some dune sites with a bit of beach and a bit of sea. And never know, we might see you out on the dune. So thank you very much, and I hope you found the presentation interesting. Thank you.
So just a final note, there are 2 more talks from Fall into Nature. You can see where they're on Plant Life's website, which is at the top of the chat. Thank you all very much. It's been really lovely to hear from you, Tim, and some fantastic questions. The final Plant Life Fall into Nature programme is wax cap watercolours. I can tell you that there are wax caps just about everywhere at the moment with all of this rain. So thank you all very much. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Tim.